So the idea of basically just doing some oversight. Understandably, there's some pushback, not just from big businesses, but sometimes we're seeing some from sort of watchdog groups that worry about what we were talking about earlier, which is that sometimes by focusing too much on security, you give up privacy, right? This is true of, in a broad sense, we think about something like facial recognition, but this happens even with AI, because if we're saying, all right, our only way of knowing what's happening with all of this data that you're gathering is for us to look at all that data you're gathering, and you're going, I think I see a problem here, right?
Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Welcome, everyone, to Spill the Tea on HR Tech, where we focus on the hottest HR tech news everyone needs to know to be in the know. We break down the news of the week and help you make sense of what it means for our industry and how it can impact your organization. We're recording today on August 28th, 2024, almost to September, Cliff, and so many things going on with back to school and Labor Day here in the United States and just travel season from an events perspective. So we're really excited to get into the topics this week. I'm your host, Stacey Harris, Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner for Sapient Insights Group. We're a research and advisory firm, if you didn't know. And joining me today for the conversation is our co-host, Cliff Stevenson, Director of Research and Principal Analyst for Sapient Insights Group. Cliff, welcome back to the show again this week. We're doing our matching colors again, so I think we're coordinated fairly well. But I mean, we were in the green room for almost 40 minutes talking about all the stuff going on. So it's a busy week. What are we going to be talking about this week for everyone?
A lot. And I was remembering another thing that's coming up in September, a little event, HR Tech. Is that? I think, I knew there was something happening. I was just trying to remember. Well, a little sort of behind the curtain for those of you listening and watching, throughout the 2-week period before we do one of these recordings, we'll both find things and send them, together and sort of consolidate and then make decisions on what kind of goes in and what doesn't. That's why often I'll say, any stories didn't get covered, you can find them in the comments or show notes or in the YouTube comments underneath. Well, to give you an idea of just how, and how these have been getting longer, right, listeners? Well, just to give you an idea, there's, I think, 8 different ones that are in the only if we have time. And usually there's 1 or 2. So think about how long these usually go, and then it goes like that. So that just gives you an idea of just how interesting, how exciting, how much neat stuff's been going on because of all the things Stacey said. So I thought we'd start off by talking about just some direct news from, the biggest of the companies that's out there, Workday, who, announced some great financial results and some new partnerships, some new stuff coming out, their model. We're going to talk about a company, Tilt, that you may not have heard of, but that's why we're here. Spill the tea on that. Salary.com, some exciting news from them, as well as with smart recruiters, some of the laws around AI. There it is, first mentioned early on. And some really interesting sort of thought leadership and questions have been brought up. We're going to talk a little bit for our international listeners, a very interesting story that was put out there about HR business partners and how that works in different countries. And we'll talk about, we have our own best of best lists, meaning, the best of those lists, but other people are doing this well too. And we're going to talk about some of those that are out there, some specific news for you Gen Xers, if we have time, and some sad news passing from a titan of the industry that we'll get to without a doubt. And like I said, if we have time, there's some fun stuff too involving Waffle House. So, something to stick around for if we have time. But let's start with that Workday.
I'm sitting here laughing about the Waffle House. Okay, I'm
now I have to get into it. It's like when we brought up Elmo, people are like, well, now you have to talk.
Now you have to talk about it. Yeah. Well, before we dive into that, I do want to let people know where we're going to be at, because we're literally heading into event season this week. So a couple quick things. You're going to be at the Oracle Cloud World event, September 9th through 11th. So if anybody wants to get a chance to talk to Cliff or have some conversations, please let us know. He'll be there representing the voice of the customer, taking notes, asking questions, doing all the things that we need to do. Also, as many of you know, the survey is closed. We're crunching data. We're going to be starting to roll out some of the information. The very first place where you're going to see us rolling out information will be at the HR Technology Conference in Las Vegas And that event is definitely going to be the place where you'll see most probably of our time spent over the next couple of months. We will be at the Workday Rising event as well. Our founder, Susan Wojcicki, is going to be there. So if you'd like to talk with her while we're there, that would be great. And at the HR Technology Conference, you'll be able to catch us in a couple different places. So just a couple of updates on what you want to put on your calendar. One is the Tuesday morning Women in HR Tech panel on creating a culture of data and transparency with our CEO, Terry Zipper, and Danielle Bouchon. That's going to be really good because Danielle is working with a great company, Sanofi, as a global head of people and data governance and stewardship. If you've ever wanted to think about how you manage data, Danielle and Terry are going to talk through those conversations and how it matters to women. Then if you want to drop by for the keynote mega session on our Voice the Customer research, that's going to be at 1:00 on Wednesday, Voice the Customer highlights, Sapient Insights Group 27th Annual HR System Survey in the Mandalay Bay Room. Please be sure to put it on your calendar, sign up early. We don't know how many people are going to be showing up for that room. And then finally, there will be an opportunity also to do some Ask the Experts on Thursday. You'll have a 9 a.m. one, 9:45 a.m. one with myself. There will be one with Susan Richards around 1:00 on change leadership. And then we're also doing a second session this time, and Cliff's going to get up on stage here. Mm-hmm. So we're going to be doing a technology agnostic approach to skills management with Cliff and I. We'll be talking about the vendors and what is showing up, what organizations are using, what they're not using, how they're doing HR skills management, but in between all the different vendors, it's going to be a good session. We'll also be, after the HR Technology Conference, jumping right in October to the iSolved event. That's going to be iSolved Connect in Orlando, Florida. So we'll be doing lots of interviews there and presentations. So please connect us there. We'll be at the Unit 4 event in Boston. That is going to be an analyst event on that November 6th and 7th. We'll be at the UKG Aspire event, November 12th and 13th. And then we'll be at the Workday European event, November 12th through 14th as well. So you can catch us in all those places. If you'd like to debrief with us, or if you'd like to just have an opportunity to talk with us, please let us know. Email us and we'll get you on the calendar. So now we can get back to talking about Workday and all the other good stuff.
No, that's great.
I'm going to plug where we're going to be at. So
no, and that's great. And I'm really glad you mentioned signing in early, because I think every single year for our Voice of the Customer keynote, it's been SRO, if not people not even be able to get in the door. So you definitely want to get in early for that. You don't want to be the person going, I didn't really think you meant it. We mean it. So, speaking of very popular things, Workday had extremely good second quarter results. So a number of different things. Total revenues up $2 billion and change. Of course, when you're talking about change, you're talking $800 or $85 million there. And that's a 16.7 increase year over year. So, all these stories you might be hearing about, things not going well, not for everyone. Things are doing just great. There's a lot of new additions too. There's some cool stuff around AI. They've actually released 2 other sort of partnerships and expansions. I can tell you about, Stacey, if you want to get into some of the more specifics. One is a Workday payroll provided by Strata, and that's going to be sort of more of the AI focus, right? So allowing you to sort of use AI to check really large data sets and check for compliance. And on that sort of international and global scene, they also have announced Global Payroll Connect. So really looking to be a single source of truth for these really large global payrolls, which is oftentimes can be very difficult. It's one thing to even get all of the different integrations and compliance things in mind. To do a single source of truth is pretty amazing, but there's a lot here to talk about. So why don't you, I know you had definitely picked up on some of the cool connections and partnerships.
Yeah. I mean, the Workday announcement, we don't always do sort of quarterly announcements for all of the vendors, but I think there was a couple here that caught our attention. One is all of this payroll focus that they've got. I think, we're definitely seeing that global payroll has become a bigger conversation for everybody, but Workday's definitely jumped into this and said, we're going to partner with a lot of organizations, and we're going to connect what we're doing with a lot of organizations. And so I think those 2 things are going to be really powerful. And that's a bit of where you're getting the Payroll Connect tool and some of the relationships. The one that caught my eye, though, which I think was a little bit more interesting to me, was the strategic partnership with Equifax. Now, that, I think a lot of people are kind of like, credit unions, where does that sort of fit in the whole longer picture, right, of everything? But most everyone who uses Equifax, or Experian is another one that does this, right? They spend a lot of time knowing that they do a lot of background checks. They do a lot of of data analysis. They do a lot of onboarding work for organizations in many cases. And so this is a pretty big relationship, I think, to just call out. It's a new integration designed to help make the employment and income verification for Workday customers easier and faster. And they're also going to be able to provide Workday payroll and the work number combination data. And that's really interesting, right? Because, Workday has now payroll, or at least some level of insights payroll, to most of the Fortune 500 and 1,000 organizations, right? Like they're over 50%, I think, in most of those areas. And either if they're not doing the payroll, they're at least getting it brought into their system in a data set. The work number, it's an income verification service, is a really good tool for a lot of organizations to just make sure that they are sort of managing that understanding of sort of what we brought people in for versus what they're making and how all that data is playing out in the market. It's also giving the market a better view of income verification across. So if you want to buy a house, it's important to get your income verified. And so those things are important from an employee perspective, that some of that stuff is seamlessly done and done in a way that is upfront and transparent as well, because that's the other part of that that's really important. So I'm interested to see more about what they're going to do with this. And I think, we'll definitely see a lot more customers probably take advantage of something like this if they're doing the payroll conversation with Dick. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that work number point is interesting. That was something that they rolled out a while back. And one of the kind of neat, cool things about it that they were looking to do is not be using our social security number so much, because that is not the original idea of a social security number. It's not supposed to be an ID verification. And, we hear about these big data breaches and things that happen. Well, one of the reasons they're so dangerous is because having your social security number get out there, of course, isn't great, right? So if you can use something else for the same purpose that isn't so dangerous to individual privacy, it really helps mitigate the damage that can be done in these sort of, rare but still important events. So,
and it's a really US centric conversation, but we know that it's the same issue in global, each country as well. So I think the idea of getting to a standard model is part of what we're seeing in the market trying to get to, right? Yeah.
Exactly it. And speaking of expansions, we see one from Tilt, their leave management solution, Series B funding for $15 million. And what's really cool about this, I think, first of all, as we always talk about, when we see this amount of money put into what could be called niche solutions, or maybe ones that aren't thought of as much as payroll, for instance, it just shows the market confidence and the importance of things like leave management. And specifically, what's interesting is that this is going to go towards strengthening partnerships, specifically with Rippling. That has been a very strong partnership for Tilt, although they also have a two-way API integration with Workday and with Paycor. So again, it's when Workday, we mentioned that sort of single source of truth, this whole idea of being able to combine all of these elements of work into a single unit seamlessly, and with, again, that two-way communication. So there's no issues here of when you pull the info or if anything doesn't fit within, one field or the other. This really shows that there's an importance here, and that, leave management is often sort of forgotten, but there's a number of things that I think we talk about that are considered the tactical side, but you can make them strategic by thinking about how they fit into the sort of holistic grouping of your HR tech.
Yeah. And we can't forget, Cliff, that when you look at our data, and we've done this analysis for 2 years in a row now, and we'll probably run it again this year. Well, we took like the top 5 things that are more highly correlated to organizations who are viewed as strategic business partners in their organization. One of those top 5 things is your leave and absence process, right? Like, I think and that is something we hear all the time. Like, well, that's just table stakes to do that well. And it is. Doing it poorly is not something you want in your organization. But how you treat people when they have a need for leave or for absence in your organization, and how you think about that on a cultural level, is really important, and it plays a big role. And a lot of it has to do with whether or not you can get the data where you need it to be so you can handle it appropriately in the organization. And so I think these are kind of exciting topics. I know a lot of people think that, leave and absence, it's just the basics. But I'm like, look, the basics make a difference. It's where everybody gets their relationship with HR started, right?
That's right. People say, oh, it's table stakes. Yeah, well, if you don't pay the table stakes, you don't get to play. So that's why they're called that. That's what lets you get involved. So yeah. And then, going from leave management to another one that we have really seen a lot more data from this year in our report, and a lot more interest is compensation management. And obviously the market is seeing the same because salary.com made the Inc. 5000 moving up nearly 500 spots, 453 spots just from last year. And salary.com is not a brand new company.
Yeah.
So this isn't a case of, they're here because, they're new. They're clearly making moves. We've seen it ourselves. We see them show up in our research. So we know that people do they have a good user experience, good vendor satisfaction. I'm not giving away any winners this year, but I will say that they've shown up in the past. So, really showing again the importance of how this all fits into a whole, especially, for something that we've talked about in past, things like pay equity and, finding specific skills and all that, compensation management starts to really become a bigger picture issue.
Yeah. I think, when we think about the growth of the compensation market, so it's interesting to note that Compa was one of the big winners last year in additional funding for organizations. And they're a compensation sort of sales relationship tool. And we've seen the constant acquisition and sort of development of what PayFactors is doing, right? Which is they sort of pulled in a lot of various vendors to sort of create what is the broader pay scale conversation. I think salary.com has always stood out to me as an organization that has kind of stood the test of time after a lot of sort of early days of doubt of whether or not there was really a business in this space, right? Mm-hmm. I think today, anybody who's here knows, yes, there's a business and there is a lot of work that needs to be done here. I always like how they're kind of a little behind the scenes and, sometimes, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, all this data is coming from the work that they're doing, right? And most people know them just for their internet tool and the salary.com back in the day, I can kind of check my salary. I think now what you're seeing is that, the growth is coming from their investment in research and their investment in sort of the tools to help manage the compensation conversation, not just the benchmarking process that goes through compensation. And most people think of compensation as a benchmarking conversation.
Yeah.
There are tools that manage it. And I'm excited to see where this space goes. I think we're going to hear a lot more about compensation in the next year or two. So yeah.
And on with the, I guess in the sort of talent management space, I'm looking for sort of the connective thread, but another thing that is a connective thread is that we're seeing more women in leadership. So Smart Recruiters appoints Rebecca Carr as their chief product officer. Wonderful to see for lots of reasons, but also because she was at Checker before. Speaking of, so.
We had a presentation with Checker not too long ago with their advisory group. But it's important to note that it's not that she moved from chief product officer that she's held for the last couple of months to their new CEO. She was interim CEO for a little while. And I think that's the part for me that I was really excited about. I've known Becca for quite some time. She started out, for those of you who kind of know the history of this space, with the Job Bite and a couple of others, even smaller organizations like Branch Out and stuff before that. She was with Smart Recruiters for many of their early years in growth. And then she left for a few years at Checker and then came back to Smart Recruiters with some breaks in between. And it's always a thing for me it's interesting to see that, when organizations are able to realize that, sometimes talent may need to leave the organization, get some additional capabilities and sort of come back to the organization. We see that happen a lot of times, a lot of places, right? And this is one of those. And I'm excited to see where Rebecca Carr will take the organization. She brings a lot of depth in the recruiting space, but I think she also brings a lot of depth in just understanding the technology market, right? And what buyers are looking for. And so I think that's gonna lend well for Smart Recruiters. Smart Recruiters always ends up in our research at a small level, but we know that a lot of organizations are using them. It'll be interesting to see if she can sort of grow that brand at a level that, will start to show up in a lot more places. I think people all know it. I oftentimes get questions about what do they do? How big is the platform? Where is it at? So I think there's an opportunity there for them to sort of expand that awareness of all that they're capable of. But it's an exciting time to see more women take leadership role. We're seeing it at organizations like we just saw up at UKG. We're definitely seeing it in organizations, around the globe in a lot of large tech firms. And this is just another example of some of the things that we're seeing in the market as them taking CEO leadership roles. I applaud it, not just because we need more women in this market, but also because they're women with really deep experience who are going to be great for what these companies are trying to achieve, right?
Absolutely. And from there, we're going to talk a little bit, as we always say, as is our mandate, we must talk about AI. And it's been interesting. So specifically, we're looking at a California law. And for our listeners outside the US, or for those of you who are new within the US, often as California law goes, and sometimes New York, so goes the rest of the nation. It's a huge state geographically and population wise. It has a huge financial push and pull on the rest of our nation. And also it's where most of our tech industry is located. So, you'll see these sort of newer laws coming up around this space, usually for those reasons. Just as a quick refresher for anyone outside wondering, well, we're talking about just one state. But this would be an AI law, basically putting some oversight onto any really large, what they're calling frontier models, which they've sort of defined, because you can't just say large, even though they are using the term, mass computing power, or 100 million in training costs. So they've tried to put a dollar sign to this. And also it would create what they're calling the frontier model division. So the idea of basically just doing some oversight. Understandably, there's some pushback, not just from big businesses, but sometimes we're seeing some from sort of watchdog groups that worry about what we were talking about earlier, which is that sometimes by focusing too much on security, you give up privacy, right? This is true of, in a broad sense, if we think about something like facial recognition, but this happens even with AI, because we're saying, all right, our only way of knowing what's happening with all of this data that you're gathering is for us to look at all that data you're gathering, and you're going, I don't think I see a problem here, right? So what usually happens is, best intentions, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll see how this goes through, it's sort of process of what do we need to change to make sure that both sides are taken care of, right? The security is important. Oversight's important, especially for something that can be so damaging environmentally and to people's privacy. So like I said, it's a nice sort of bellwether for what we might see from future U.S. laws.
Yeah. And I think the interesting thing about this is a lot of times we see regulations come out that are more sort of like about the data, like the employee data or the business data or and because that affects everybody who sort of works in or sort of deals with those companies, because it's from all over the world or all over the globe. The interesting thing about this, kind of flip this conversation a little bit. And it's like, we want to understand the model that you're building, which means talking about the actual IP inside that company. And so I think that's where we're getting a lot of pushback from a lot of those organizations is, sharing that information with state agencies. There is a concern that there will be some challenges with sort of keeping that IP private, right? Or keeping the understanding of what that IP is doing, especially for organizations who are just getting started in this market compared to those who have been able to sort of run free for the last several years without any oversight, right? And so I think these are all well, intentioned conversation. I think where this is going to have an impact on the HR space and the IT space is that, one, if you are one of those organizations, and there are a number of them who are developing your own artificial intelligence model inside your company, and many times inside an individual company has more data sets and more sort of capabilities than any one sort of large SaaS solution, because you're dealing with very large numbers for very large companies like a Walmart or something, right? Then you've got to, am I stepping over these bounds? You're held just as accountable as any, right? Like, so if you're not in the tech industry, but you're still doing your own AI models and you're putting your employee data in them from a training perspective, which is a large data set, then you've got to kind of think about this. Does this fit into that picture? So I think you really have to understand how this fits for you if you have any sort of a location in that California region, but it could become across the country as well. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That's kind of the way to look at it. And that's one of the reasons I think why in our data sets, speaking of, we've started looking more at, what are you doing with the AI? How are you finding use in it? And so that way we're saying, okay, it's not just AI is like a blanket thing, but where are you finding value? Because, maybe you don't need to take part in these huge data sets. Maybe that's just not necessary. There's plenty of value to be found in something else. In fact, here's a good segue. I do say so myself. The next article is, I want to say, courtesy of Johan Sundlo through LinkedIn. And it's a summary of a really wonderful study. And they mentioned, that within the post that they use Claude, the Anthropic's AI, for the summarization of the study, although they do, you should read it yourself, which is interesting. But, again, that's a good use. It's a very long study. You kind of want to get the point of it. And it goes to something that we always find these themes, don't we, in these recordings. And this one really has been a lot about the difference between European specifically, but really we could say global, and US markets, especially for HR. And what they're looking at within this study, and again, I'll have the links to both of this, whether you're on YouTube or in the show notes. So on LinkedIn is usually the best way to find it, is looking at HR as a whole, and especially HR business partner role has really been defined by United States and North American views of how it should be done. And in summary of an academic study, they're really finding is that we focus so much on strategy, and that the HR business partner's role is to, be more of a strategic thinker and to sort of take that sort of, almost leadership role. And in Scandinavian and Nordic countries, that's not what they're being asked to do, nor does that fit in with the organizational culture, so to speak. So, we really have to think about how do we best serve our organizations with a larger, a cultural context. Is this what we're being asked to do? I always think of when I was really studying a lot in performance management, and there was such a big movement of getting rid of it. And we found that in many stratified cultures and Indian cultures and some South Asian cultures where this was the one opportunity to meet someone from sort of a higher group, higher class, whatever the term would be used in those countries, then they didn't want that taken away. There was no sense doing a flat structure because that's not how everything worked, and it would have worked well for that company, right? So just saying, get rid of performance management is a very sort of North American centric way of looking. And this is sort of taking an academic view to that same thing. And I really find it fascinating because while they're not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with taking a strategic view, it's really thinking about what are you being asked from your managers? How do you operationally support them as an HR business partner? And are you hearing it, or are you just doing kind of what you've been taught in books? And as we know, there's a lot of younger people getting into HR. And, to be fair, we talk about quite a bit about being strategic, but those aren't in opposition, as we kind of talked about before. Being tactical or doing the day-to-day work or the table stakes is not in opposition to being strategic.
We're all doing it. We all done it, right? Yeah. And there are a lot of times when you're asked to do the tactical stuff plus the strategic at the same time. You got to kind of do both, right? Cliff, I was glad you actually pulled this one out because I know it wasn't one of the sort of most sort of techie news this week. But I just want to call out Johan Sandel. I don't believe I've had the opportunity to speak with him. I started following him about a year and a half ago when he first started talking about AI, because he was one of the few people who was actually going in and testing a lot of the tools and using them in different ways. And he's kind of built a brand and a name around sort of the AI and artificial intelligence market. But what I really like is that he brings his experience from his work into this conversation. So up until 2019, he was the global HR business partner at Spotify there in Stockholm, Sweden. And so that, he really, I think this article really fell into this conversation he's been having with the market, which is let's stop talking about AI and technology and even the business models that we have in sort of a broadly US centric model, right? Let's think about this with an international focus. And so I really liked sort of how he approached it, knowing that a lot of the emerging tech sometimes comes out of where funding comes out of, right? And so I think this is an opportunity to really talk a little bit about the funding models and where that comes for all of this HR technology and the AI technology, right? And where all the sort of the universities are teaching the models, all of that kind of stuff plays into this conversation. He's well worth following. I think we'll link him to the site, and maybe at some point in time we can get him on the podcast to have a conversation. But I just think it's always good to hear from those different perspectives, right? I remember when I was in the HR space, sort of having conversations with HR business excellence, and I can remember the idea that they would, a lot of times they were sort of put in this generalist role versus sort of a business partner role, right? And those are real conversations, and that's a thing we have to have. And it changes by culture and region and company environment as to how does all this work get broken up. We got a little bit of that in the report this year we're going to be talking about, which is we're seeing a shift in that market. We've been talking about it for a while, but the HR function itself is having to change to address all of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's even one of the things that they recommend is that we recommend in the study more support and training to develop those sort of business and strategic competencies that may not have been part of their own training. So, speaking of people doing things very well, obviously we're going to be unveiling the Voice of the Customer awards.
You mentioned that your thunder behind you is.
Oh, you can hear that. I was wondering if the mic was good enough.
Sound effects to go with all this.
Yeah, this is good ASMR for those of you that are into that. You can fall asleep to this once I'm finished talking. That is, we've got that. I was wondering, this is the danger of having really good mics, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it should be more energetic though, I would hope, because these are good things. We're going to be, as I said, mentioning our own Voice of the Customer winners, but others are coming out, also talking about some of the top tech products. This one is from HR Executive, our good friends over there. This is a sort of more broadly based view of it. And, rather than, taking the pure just Voice of the Customer as it, says on the tin, they're kind of looking at what they've seen and taking that, their sort of opinion on it, but still pretty interesting. A lot of the ones we're seeing as well, Vizier, V for analytics, Benefits, Salt Labs, Chinese company there, and also Paychex Flex Perks. And, that's pretty interesting. Some of the new stuff that we've seen. Yeah, it's very interesting by the thunder there. And Core HR, Paycom time off request, another point there for the leave management and time, right? And then employee engagements, Perceptics and Culturex Voice, Dayforce Career Explorer, and then talent acquisition. We get HireView, Find My Phenoms automation engine, and Claro, which we mentioned on this podcast, I want to say back in February. So that's pretty neat that Claro went from being brand new all the way to being named one of the top ones right there. And then talent management, Beamery, Experian with some of the employer services. I think you mentioned them earlier. BetterWorks, their talent profiles.
And I want to just highlight here because I think this one is an interesting one. Steve Bose has done this for the last many, many years. I don't know how many years. And this is very focused on emerging technologies to some extent. What's new, what's going on. And he's got a panel that sort of reviews this and they go through all the products. It's a pretty extensive process that HR Executive magazine put the market through. And what I think there's a couple of really big call outs in this one is, one, we are seeing a couple of organizations that Cliff has mentioned that are a little bit bigger than that. And then there's a lot of really small ones in this. And I think that's always an interesting conversation to have in this, which is, how do you get attention if you're a small organization versus how do you sort of also look innovative when you're an organization that's been in the market for a long time like Vizier, right? And so we're seeing a bit of that in this data this year. I do want to call it Salt Labs. Jason Lee, this is a company that actually was bought by Chime Company. Mm-hmm. They were very just starting fresh last year, and we had mentioned them in one of our emerging tech notifications in my presentation. We'll be doing that again this year, calling out some of the emerging tech groups we think that you should be paying attention to. Hard to show up on our data with emerging tech because, as a voice of the customer, you have to have at least a certain number of responses to our research. So we do a little bit of that in our presentation. I also think calling out a little bit of what we're seeing here in the sort of culture space. That's kind of a category that I don't know that we talk a lot about because it shows up in different places, but it is interesting to see Perceptic and Dayforce in this one, right? Because Dayforce, I don't know, would have always been thought of as a culture-based platform. And so it's good to see that we're seeing, again, a smaller, newer company with one of those organizations that have been around for a long time and how they're competing in this plays a big role, right? So I think what you're gonna see this year on the floor at the HR Technology Expo Hall in Las Vegas, if you're going, is a really wide mix of both long-standing HR tech organizations and smaller HR tech organizations really battling it out because the tools are sort of balancing out, right? AI is allowing some of these organizations to grow more quickly, get their systems up and running more in advance. But we're also seeing that this market there's room and breadth now because of so many acquisitions over the last year to start to see some new ones come up out of the woodwork. So I'm excited to see where all this goes, right? So yeah.
Well, if Stacey's predicted that you can take it to the bank, so I don't know if there's a way to put money on that, but it is in Vegas, so we'll find out. Now, one that you kind of sent me sort of just for fun, and I have to call it out just because we're both Gen Xers, is one that was Gen Xers were voted the best managers among their colleagues. And
take our bound out.
yeah, that was from Benefit News. Yeah, that's right. So as they said, you got to go to this. As I always say, we'll put the link in the comments. But Stacey, you pointed out, you got to read the comments. And so I loved it because this is my favorite phenomenon. Now I can say this because I'm a Gen Xer. There's nothing Gen X like more than talking about themselves. And sure enough, everyone's going, yeah, I totally agree. This is why we're so great. One person who specifically called out because rap, punk, EDM, and go-go in DC, shout out to the go-go fans, existed. I just love this. Anytime you bring a Gen Xer, they're like, somehow we're going to work punk into this conversation. It's going to happen.
Yes.
That's why we're good managers, is Fugazi, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So I love to see it. It was a delight.
And just to add to this picture, so Cliff comes back from Comic-Con this week. The picture for me of all these plaid shirts with all these great pictures of amazing movies, and I'm like, there's nothing more Gen X than the plaid shirt with movie themes and quotes, because this is how Cliff and I engage, because we both like movies, and I will wear my plaid when I'm off season and not in presentations. And so we had a good laugh about that. And I'm just thinking, this is okay. Now we're really getting into the whole Gen X theme of things. Now we have to find some pink colored plaid shirts. That's my next search for.
Go back. So now the last story could be seen as a little sad, but I think we'd like to treat it as a sort of celebration of life. And that was that the former YouTube CEO, Susan Wojcicki, died at 56, lung cancer, very early. And I want to say and again, a thank you to Shabani Berry, who put this post up, who I didn't realize until she put the post up, just how extraordinary Susan's life was, as we talked about women in leadership. There's a ton of highlights here. And actually, Stacey, if you want to pick any of sort of your favorites, the just whole, didn't realize like how much she was involved in Google's beginnings. It was literally her garage when they talk about, started in a garage. That's hers.
Yeah, the Google garage is famous. That it was her garage is not probably always as mentioned as well, right? She rented her garage out for the startup of Google to Sergey and Larry. I think the thing that caught my eye on this, and you and I talked a little bit about this, is that in many cases, the people behind the scenes in some of these organizations, it's names you wouldn't know all the time, right? Apple's Wozniak, right? And unless you're into the tech space, you probably wouldn't know that as well, right? Like understanding those who stood behind the big names and really help them see, not just channel the capabilities that a lot of entrepreneurs have, and entrepreneurs are really tough. I know I'm one of them now, to sort of focus and get, narrowed in on an area that's going to not only sustain the organization, but focus on sort of what's going to actually, be of value to the market down the road is hard. And Susan's I remember hearing her talk at an event, probably, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something. It's been a long time. And I was always just, at that point in time, I thought, wow, she's in there really working with this technology and the marketing of it and the messaging of it in a way that it made me rethink a little bit of my perspectives on, because when I first got into the tech business, I was very much, don't market to me, don't sell to me. I just want to, go demo my stuff. Even as an analyst, I was always a little bit less interested in the marketing side of things. A big part of her background was all of the marketing and understanding the value of the perception of Google, right, in the space. And I really came to understand over time that perception is reality for a lot of people, right? Like you have to make sure your brand has a message. Your brand is seen as standing not just for something, but that what it stands for in general, right? And I think she was a big part of that for Google. The other thing I thought that was powerful is that she saw the power of YouTube a little bit earlier than probably some others did in the organization. In 2006, YouTube was bought by Google, and it was recommended by her. And it was after Google tried to do their own video platform and didn't quite make it, right? And she eventually became the CEO. I mean, Cliff, you use YouTube probably more than I do, but it really has become a staple in the market that I don't think we ever realized was going to happen back then, right?
Here we are recording on YouTube. We mentioned it. I am one of those people that has switched to listening to most of my podcasts, ones that already existed, onto Google. Strange enough, sometimes even when there's not pictures, just because I don't know, I just find it easy to scan and put everything together. And really, there's so many of us, and we've seen in our own data that has become our sort of preferred information gathering, entertainment, whatever you want to call it, thing that's taken the place of a whole lot of different aspects of our lives. So, and what's amazing is that, yeah, it was her recommendation. She oversaw that. And at the time, there were multiple platforms, just as there were multiple search engines for Google. And so it seemed like a lot of money. I mean, 1.65 billion seems like a lot of money, period. But I mean, especially then. And to have that vision of, taking that on when it really wasn't part of their core brand and then making it part of what they do. It really is amazing to have had that vision. I also want to point out that, we've talked about work-life balance, 5 children. So in that time period, and just amazing. So really, our thoughts, prayers, condolences go out to the family at this time because of how young it was. But I really do want to celebrate everything she's done because it is now part of, strangely enough, the HR tech fabric. It's part of what we use. It's part of communication. We see it in emerging tech as one of the premier ways that people are gathering information and learning about things. We're seeing ads for all these companies we talked about being on YouTube, depending on what you watch, of course. They have a targeted advertisement. They make their money same as anyone else.
In 2018, YouTube generated more than twice the revenue of any major TV network. Again, the vision for understanding that back in the day when, the 3 major channels, 4 major channels, depending on what you were watching, was how you did advertisement. Yeah. Like I said, I think leadership, being a female side and having 5 children, all of those things, which I think again is a balanced conversation. And we've seen a lot of there are others who have achieved that. But I think for me, it was her vision and understanding of that brand relationship that really made a difference. And I think and helped us start to understand this concept of brand in the market, right? Google is one of the first forefronts to understand that brand was as powerful from a tech company perspective as anything else, right? Yeah.
Well, I think we've run out of time. I know we promised to talk about some other stuff, but I really do want to sort of leave everyone with that strong leadership, vision. But, there are a number of other ones. As always, I'll put them in the comments, in the YouTube, in the LinkedIn. But you can also reach out to me or to Stacey directly. There's always, as we say, stories that are in, if we have time. There was a great one. This was from a Gartner HR survey that found Australian organizations lacking employee-centered innovation, really looking at the employee sentiment in Australia specifically and seeing some really big drops, decline of nearly 10% in the feeling of how innovative employees felt their organization was, going from 24.5 all the way down to 14. And as I mentioned, there was a story about Chatter. That's 2 T's and no vowels because how everything has to be spelled now. And that particular tool being used for Waffle House. So a lot of, that's for our Southern listeners. They'll all know what's up with that. Chatter themselves is from Tampa, Florida, very close to my location. So you can learn all about that if you're interested in those sort of more regional things. But, always like to give a shout out to our Southern and Australian listeners and viewers.
Yeah. There's a lot of good links there this year that we didn't get to today, but it is important for us to at least keep this in somewhat of a length time that our marketing team can manage. So we're going to have to sort of wrap it up today, Cliff. So I appreciate that. Just as we're wrapping up today, just a couple of big reminders is, again, if you are interested in buying next year's annual HR System Survey white paper, it is available right now, not for download, but you can buy one, get one for free, kind of a combo, what we call the bundle, which is if you could buy last year's report, you'll get next year's report for free when it comes out. So it's kind of that model. Also, just to understand, and that you can find on our website as well, is that if you're interested in hearing about all the details about the research, where it's coming out, all the stuff, also anything about what we're doing, where we'll be at, be sure to sign up for our newsletter, and all of our ongoing updates on our research and launches there that you can get to on our website as well. And then be sure to listen to our sister HR Huddle podcast, HR We Have a Problem, hosted by our CEO, Terry Dipper. There's a really good one out right now. By the time you're in, this will be about a week behind what Jason's saying. It is good. It is talking about grief and how we handle that in our organizations. And so I I think you should take some time to listen to that. It's important. And I think it really kind of hones in on some of the things a lot of people have been dealing with since the COVID crisis. Also, if you'd like to help support this podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and a review. That is really, really helpful for us. And to stay up to date with immediate breaking HR tech news and get all the behind the scenes content as we're doing all of our traveling, please make sure that you're following us on Sapient Insights on LinkedIn, on X and Instagram, as well as Cliff and myself. And Cliff, thanks again for pulling all this together. Thanks to our brand media method group, who helps us produce our podcast and run by their amazing founder, Kelly, and to our marketing team, Summer Roleno, and all of those who support her, because we couldn't get this out without that support. And thanks to our listeners in our community. We couldn't do this without you. We do want to hear from you if there's other things you want us to be talking about. We keep adding to this list of topics, but we definitely hear from you guys that you're enjoying the podcast. So we'll keep kind of doing what we're doing. That's it for this episode of Spilling the Tea on HR Tech. Cliff, just in time for your storm to be bypassing. I think we can hear it going off into the background. We hope it's been just the brew you needed to start the engines running this week. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with another pot of boiling hot HR tech updates and insights. Thanks, everyone. Bye.